Vet turns pale upon seeing the horse's newborns. They weren't what he expected. The sun hung low over the vast Texas plains, casting long shadows across the Armstrong family ranch. Leaning against the paddock fence, Sarah kept her eyes fixed on Rosie, their golden chestnut mare, who grazed peacefully nearby. The late afternoon breeze carried the familiar scent of hay and earth, a comforting reminder of home. Yet despite the tranquility of the scene, Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of concern. Rosie wasn't just a horse, she was family. She had been by Sarah's side since childhood, a steadfast companion through every milestone, heartbreak, and dream. Sarah had never considered the possibility that one day, Rosie might need her more than she needed Rosie. But today, that moment had arrived. "Sarah, we're not done yet. Need you in the barn," John's voice called from behind her. Turning, Sarah saw her father wiping his hands on a rag, his face etched with the marks of both a long day's labor and a lifetime of hard choices. At 55, John Armstrong was a man of few words, driven by logic and the demands of ranch life. He didn't dwell on emotions when there was work to be done, and he certainly didn't make decisions based on sentiment. "I'll be there in a second," Sarah answered, her voice softer than usual. She lingered at the fence a moment longer, watching as Rosie's ears flicked toward a distant sound. "You're strong, girl," she whispered. "We'll figure this out." Drawing a deep breath, she turned toward the barn, her boots crunching against the dirt path. Inside, the air was thick with the warm, earthy scent of hay. Dr. Benson, the veterinarian, was packing up his equipment, his expression grave. Sarah's stomach clenched. "So, what's the verdict?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the growing knot in her chest. Dr. Benson hesitated, his gaze shifting between Sarah and John. "Rosie's pregnant, but this isn't a normal pregnancy," he said, pulling a small folder from his bag and handing it to John. "She's carrying twins." Sarah's breath hitched, her fingers instinctively gripping the edge of a nearby stall for support. "Twins," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is that even possible?" "It's rare," Dr. Benson admitted. "Extremely rare and dangerous. Horses aren't built to carry two foals to term. Most of the time, one or both don't survive, and the mare's in serious danger." His voice was gentle, but the weight of experience pressed behind every word. John's jaw tightened as his thumb traced the edge of the folder. "What are we looking at here, Doc?" "The safest course of action is to terminate one of the embryos," Dr. Benson stated matter-of-factly. "That will give Rosie and the remaining foal the best chance of survival." The words struck Sarah like a physical blow. "Terminate?" she echoed, her voice rising. "No! There has to be another way. Rosie's strong. She's healthy. She can do this." Dr. Benson sighed. "I understand how you feel, Sarah. But this isn't about strength or health. It's about biology. Carrying twins puts immense strain on a mare's body. Even if she does make it to term, there's no guarantee either foal will survive." John raised a hand to quiet Sarah before she could argue further. "We appreciate your honesty, Doc. Let us think about it." Dr. Benson nodded, gathering the last of his things. "I'll give you some time, but don't take too long. The earlier we intervene, the better the chances for Rosie and the remaining foal." With that, he left, the barn door swinging shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah glared at her father, her hands clenched at her sides. "You're not seriously considering this, are you?" "Sarah," John began, his voice calm but firm. "You heard him. This isn't just about Rosie. It's about the foals too. We have to think about what's best for all of them." "What's best is trusting Rosie," Sarah shot back. "She's not some fragile animal, Dad. She's tough. She survived every challenge this ranch has thrown at her. Why can't we give her a chance?" John sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "And if it kills her? What then? You're not thinking about the long term. This isn't just about what you want, Sarah. It's about what's responsible." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "What's responsible is standing by Rosie. She's never given up on us. How can we give up on her?" Without waiting for a response, she turned and stormed out of the barn, the door slamming shut behind her. Outside, the evening air was cool against her flushed face. Sarah wiped her eyes and walked to the paddock, where Rosie still grazed, oblivious to the turmoil surrounding her. Leaning against the fence, Sarah let out a shaky breath. "You've got a fight ahead of you, girl," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "But I believe in you. I always have." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the ranch in shades of gold and amber. Sarah stayed by the fence, her heart heavy, but her resolve unshaken. She didn't know how, but she was determined to find a way to help Rosie and her unborn foals. The mare had been there for her through everything. Now it was Sarah's turn to return the favor. As the first stars appeared in the sky, John watched from the barn door, his expression unreadable. He'd seen the fire in Sarah's eyes before, the same fire her mother used to have. It was both her greatest strength and her greatest vulnerability. Shaking his head, he stepped back inside, knowing the days ahead would test them all in ways they couldn't yet imagine. For now, the ranch settled into the quiet hum of evening. Rosie stood in her paddock, a silent symbol of resilience against the odds. And Sarah, with her heart full of determination, began planning for the battle ahead. The mornings on the ranch were Sarah's favorite time. The cool air filled with the soft sounds of animals stirring and the faint orange glow of the sun cresting the horizon. But today, the familiar serenity felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. She stood by Rosie's stall, watching the mare munch on her morning feed. Rosie seemed content, oblivious to the weight of the decision looming over her. Sarah reached out to stroke her neck, the mare's warm breath puffing softly against her hand. "We've got this, girl," she whispered, though the words felt as much for herself as for Rosie. Her father's heavy boots echoed across the barn floor, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. John carried a clipboard in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other, his face as unreadable as always. He stopped at the stall, his gaze briefly meeting Sarah's before shifting to Rosie. "She looks good," he said, his tone neutral. "Strong." "She is strong," Sarah replied, her voice sharper than she intended. She softened slightly, taking a deep breath. "Dad, you know she can handle this." John leaned against the stall, setting his coffee on the edge of the rail. "Sarah, I get where you're coming from. I really do. But this isn't about emotions. It's about facts. And the fact is, horses aren't meant to carry twins." Sarah clenched her fists, trying to keep her frustration in check. "But Rosie isn't just any horse. She's ours, and she's always come through for us." "Coming through for us isn't the same as defying nature," John said, his voice steady but firm. He sighed, running a hand over his weathered face. "We've got time to decide, but not much. I need you to understand that this isn't about giving up on her. It's about giving her the best chance to survive." Sarah's jaw tightened. She wanted to argue, to make him see how much faith she had in Rosie, but she knew her father too well. He wouldn't budge easily. Instead, she turned her attention back to the mare, her fingers absently brushing through Rosie's mane. "We'll see," she murmured, more to herself than to him. The days that followed were a blur of work and worry. Sarah threw herself into caring for Rosie, adjusting her feed to include supplements recommended by Dr. Benson and keeping a close eye on her behavior. She spent hours reading articles and reaching out to online forums for horse owners who had faced similar situations. Some shared stories of heartbreak, while others spoke of rare, miraculous successes. Every post fueled her determination, even as the doubts lingered at the edges of her mind. John, meanwhile, busied himself with the practicalities of ranch life, but Sarah could see the strain in his movements. He wasn't one to talk about his feelings, but she caught him standing by the paddock in the evenings, his hands on his hips and his gaze distant. She knew he was wrestling with the decision as much as she was, even if he wouldn't admit it. One afternoon, as Sarah was brushing Rosie in the paddock, a dark line of clouds began to gather on the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and a faint rumble of thunder. She glanced up, her stomach tightening. The weather had been unpredictable lately, and the last thing they needed was a storm. "Looks like a bad one's coming," John called from the barn. "We need to get the animals secured." Sarah nodded, quickly leading Rosie back to her stall. She worked alongside her father, rounding up the cattle and making sure the smaller animals were sheltered. By the time they finished, the storm was nearly upon them, the sky a deep, roiling gray. The first drops of rain began to fall as Sarah stepped into the barn, her hair plastered to her forehead. She checked on Rosie, who seemed calm despite the rising wind and distant cracks of thunder. But as the storm intensified, Sarah's nerves frayed. The rain pounded against the roof and the wind howled through the cracks in the barn walls. Rosie shifted uneasily in her stall, her ears flicking back and forth. "It's okay, girl," Sarah said, her voice low and soothing. She stayed by the stall, stroking Rosie's neck and humming softly, trying to keep both of them calm. The storm raged for hours, the relentless noise wearing on Sarah's nerves. She barely noticed the passage of time until a loud crash echoed outside. Her heart leapt into her throat as she rushed to the barn door, John close behind her. A large tree had fallen near the paddock, its branches tangled in the fence. The sight sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Sarah. "If that had hit the barn," she muttered, her voice trailing off. "But it didn't," John said, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "We'll deal with it in the morning." They returned to the barn, but Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Rosie seemed restless, her movements more agitated than before. Sarah stayed by her side late into the night, her mind replaying the crash in the storm's fury. When the storm finally passed, the ranch was left in eerie silence. The next morning, the damage was evident. Fallen branches, flooded ditches, and the paddock fence in desperate need of repair. But Rosie seemed unscathed, her calm demeanor a small comfort in the chaos. As Sarah and John worked to clean up the debris, they spoke little, their focus on the tasks at hand. But as the day wore on, John paused, leaning on his shovel and looking at Sarah. "You really believe she can do this, don't you?" Sarah met his gaze, her expression resolute. "I do, and I need you to believe it too." John studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Let's give her a chance. But if things go south, we have to be ready to act. Agreed?" "Agreed," Sarah said, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and determination. That evening, as the sun set over the ranch, Sarah sat by Rosie's stall, the faint glow of lantern light casting long shadows across the barn. She rested her forehead against the mare's warm neck, a quiet promise forming in her heart. No matter what lay ahead, she would fight for Rosie and her unborn foals with everything she had. The ranch settled into a tentative calm, the storm's chaos giving way to a fragile sense of hope. But Sarah knew the real battle was only just beginning. The summer sun bore down relentlessly on the ranch, turning the air heavy and the fields brittle beneath its glare. Sarah moved with purpose through the barn, her every step carrying the weight of the weeks that had passed. Rosie's belly had grown noticeably larger, the gentle curve of life within her unmistakable now. But with every day that brought them closer to the birth, the tension in Sarah's chest grew tighter. She'd spent countless hours with Rosie, tending to her, monitoring every subtle shift in her behavior, every flick of her ears. And while the mare still carried herself with the quiet strength Sarah had always admired, there were moments when fatigue seeped into her movements. John had noticed it too. Though he tried to mask his concern behind the veneer of practicality, Sarah could see the worry in the way he lingered by Rosie's stall, his brow furrowed as he leaned on the door. He'd been quieter lately, his usual bluntness softened by the shared uncertainty of what lay ahead. One evening, after finishing the day's chores, he stood next to Sarah outside Rosie's paddock, his arms crossed as they watched the mare graze. "She's hanging in there," he said, his voice low but thoughtful. "She's more than hanging in there," Sarah replied, a faint edge of defensiveness creeping into her tone. "She's doing great." John nodded but didn't respond, his gaze fixed on Rosie as if willing her to remain strong. He knew better than to argue, but Sarah could feel the unspoken tension between them, the silent clash of optimism and caution that had defined so much of their conversations lately. As the days stretched into weeks, Rosie's pregnancy began to test not only her physical limits, but the resilience of everyone around her. It wasn't long before the first major scare arrived. Sarah was in the kitchen, rinsing vegetables for dinner, when a sharp cry from the paddock jolted her upright. The sound was unmistakable. Rosie. Dropping the colander into the sink, she bolted out the door, her boots kicking up dust as she sprinted toward the paddock. Rosie was on the ground, her legs splayed awkwardly beneath her, her sides heaving as she struggled to rise. Sarah's heart seized in her chest as she slid to a stop beside the mare, her hands immediately going to Rosie's neck. "Easy, girl," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I'm here. You're okay." John was there moments later, his face pale and drawn. He crouched opposite Sarah, his hands steady as he examined Rosie's legs. "Looks like she slipped," he said tightly. "No obvious injuries, but we need to get her up." They called Dr. Benson to check on her that evening. The veterinarian's arrival brought a mixture of relief and apprehension, his calm demeanor doing little to mask the gravity of his examination. After a thorough check, he stepped back, his hands resting on his hips. "She's lucky," he said, glancing between Sarah and John. "No serious injuries, but she's clearly feeling the strain. You'll need to keep an even closer eye on her from here on out. Any additional stress could tip the scales." The warning lingered like a shadow over the ranch in the days that followed. Sarah found herself waking in the middle of the night, listening for any sound from the barn that might signal trouble. She spent every spare moment with Rosie, massaging her legs, brushing her coat, and whispering words of encouragement as if they could bolster the mare's resolve. Rosie, for her part, seemed to rally. Her appetite returned with renewed vigor, and though she moved more slowly than before, there was a determination in her that mirrored Sarah's own. It was as if the mare understood the stakes, her every step an act of quiet defiance against the odds stacked against her. The ranch community began to take notice of the unfolding drama. Neighbors stopped by more frequently, some bringing fresh hay or supplies, others offering words of encouragement. Mrs. Harper, who lived down the road, even brought a hand-knitted blanket for Rosie, its vibrant patchwork a testament to the collective hope that had taken root among them. Sarah found unexpected solace in these moments of connection. The ranch, which had always felt like her world, now seemed to expand, its borders stretching to include the kindness of those who shared in their struggle. Even John, who had always preferred to handle things on his own, seemed to soften under the weight of their support. One afternoon, as Sarah stood with Rosie in the paddock, a car pulled up the long dirt drive. It was Mrs. Harper again, this time accompanied by a retired equine specialist named Dr. Lowell. "Thought you could use a second opinion," Mrs. Harper said with a warm smile. Dr. Lowell spent hours examining Rosie and consulting with Dr. Benson's notes, his meticulous attention to detail both reassuring and nerve-wracking. When he finally spoke, his words carried a measured optimism. "She's holding up better than I expected," he said, "but she's going to need every ounce of care you can give her. You've done well so far. Keep it up." That evening, as the sun dipped low and cast the ranch in golden light, Sarah sat on an overturned bucket outside Rosie's stall. The mare stood quietly, her head low as she dozed. The blanket Mrs. Harper had made was draped over her back, its bright colors a stark contrast to the muted tones of the barn. Sarah rested her chin in her hands, her mind replaying the events of the day. There were still so many unknowns, so many moments when the weight of it all felt like too much to bear. But as she watched Rosie shift slightly, her ears flicking towards some distant sound, Sarah felt a spark of hope reignite within her. Rosie hadn't given up, and neither would she. The night brought with it a rare stillness, the kind that seemed to envelop the ranch in a cocoon of quiet resolve. For the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to believe that they might just make it through this together. Rosie's resilience was a constant reminder of the strength they both carried, even in the face of uncertainty. And as the stars emerged one by one, their faint light glinting off the barn roof, Sarah leaned back against the stall, her heart heavy but steadfast, ready for whatever came next. The ranch was unusually quiet, the stillness of the evening broken only by the occasional rustling of the wind through the dry grass. Sarah paced in the barn, her boots scuffing softly against the floor as she glanced repeatedly at Rosie. The mare's sides rose and fell steadily, but her movements had grown restless throughout the day. Sarah had noticed the way Rosie pawed at the ground with her hoof, the subtle shifts in her posture, and the heavy breaths that seemed to deepen as the hours passed. The signs were unmistakable. Tonight was the night. John entered the barn carrying a lantern, his expression a careful mix of calm and concern. He set the lantern on the workbench and stood beside Sarah, folding his arms. "You sure she's ready?" he asked quietly, his voice cutting through the heavy air. Sarah nodded without hesitation. "I've seen the signs all day. Dr. Benson said we'd know when it was time, and this is it." She reached for Rosie's halter, gently stroking the mare's nose. "She's been trying to tell us. We just have to listen." John sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, I'll call Dr. Benson. Make sure everything's ready in case she needs help." He hesitated for a moment before placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You've done good, Sarah. Rosie's lucky to have you." Sarah turned to him, surprised by the rare sentiment, but she only nodded. There wasn't time for anything more. Her focus was solely on Rosie and the monumental task ahead. As John stepped outside to make the call, Sarah moved into action. She spread fresh straw across the stall floor, ensuring it was soft and clean. She filled the water bucket and arranged the supplies the vet had left behind. Clean towels, iodine, and gloves. The barn felt like a sanctuary, the lantern light casting a warm glow on the walls as the sun sank below the horizon. Rosie let out a low nicker, her ears flicking towards Sarah as if seeking reassurance. "I'm here, girl," Sarah murmured, her voice steady despite the rapid thud of her heart. She knelt beside the mare, running her hands over Rosie's side, feeling the slight tremors rippling through her body. "We're going to get through this together." The hours dragged on, each one marked by a growing tension that settled thickly over the barn. John returned with Dr. Benson in tow, the veterinarian's calm demeanor a welcome presence. He immediately set to work, examining Rosie with practiced precision. "She's progressing well," he said, his tone reassuring, "but it's going to be a long night." Sarah nodded, never taking her eyes off Rosie. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. This was what she'd been preparing for. Every late night, every whispered promise to Rosie, every argument with her father had led to this. She wouldn't falter now. As the hours stretched into the early morning, Rosie's labor intensified. The mare groaned softly, her muscles straining as she shifted restlessly in the stall. Sarah stayed by her side, her hands steady as she offered quiet words of encouragement. John hovered nearby, his usual stoicism giving way to a quiet worry that he didn't bother to hide. Then came the moment they had all been waiting for. Rosie let out a deep, guttural sound, her entire body quivering with effort. Dr. Benson leaned forward, his hands working quickly and methodically. "The first one's coming," he said, his voice calm but firm. Sarah held her breath as a slick, glistening form emerged into the straw. Dr. Benson worked quickly, clearing the foal's airways and helping it take its first breaths. The sound of a tiny, tentative whinny filled the barn, and Sarah felt a wave of relief so powerful it left her lightheaded. "It's a colt," Dr. Benson announced, handing the foal to Sarah. Tears blurred Sarah's vision as she cradled the colt, his silver-gray coat shimmering in the lantern light. "Silver," she whispered. "His name is Silver." She gently placed him near Rosie, who turned her head to nuzzle him, her exhaustion momentarily giving way to maternal instinct. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. Rosie groaned again, her muscles tensing as another contraction rippled through her body. Dr. Benson's expression grew serious. "The second one is on its way, but this is where it gets tricky," he warned. Sarah's heart clenched as she watched Rosie struggle, the mare's strength visibly waning. She glanced at her father, whose jaw was tight with worry, and then back at Dr. Benson. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Just stay calm and be ready to help," he replied. "Rosie's been strong so far. We have to trust her to finish this." The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Rosie's groans grew louder, her body straining against the immense effort. Sarah knelt beside her, one hand resting on Rosie's side, the other clutching a towel as if it could somehow anchor her. "You've got this, girl," she whispered desperately. "You've come this far. Don't give up now." At last, the second foal appeared, smaller and more fragile than the first. Dr. Benson's hands moved quickly, clearing the foal's airways and gently stimulating its tiny body. For a moment, the barn was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Then a weak but determined cry broke the tension, and Sarah felt her knees give out beneath her as relief washed over her. "It's a filly," Dr. Benson said with a smile, handing the foal to Sarah. The filly's coat was a soft, creamy white, her delicate frame trembling as Sarah held her close. "Willow," Sarah murmured, tears streaming down her face. "Her name is Willow." She placed Willow beside Rosie, who turned her head to nuzzle the filly, just as she had with Silver. The sight of the mare and her two foals together was almost too much to bear, a testament to the strength and love that had carried them all through this journey. The barn fell into a peaceful quiet as the first rays of dawn crept through the cracks in the walls. Rosie lay stretched out in the straw, her head resting near her foals as they nuzzled against her. Dr. Benson packed up his supplies, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. "They're all going to be fine," he said, clapping John on the shoulder. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his gaze softening as he looked at Sarah. "You were right," he said simply. "Rosie's stronger than I gave her credit for." Sarah smiled through her tears, her heart full to bursting. "She's amazing," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the ranch, Sarah stayed in the barn, watching over Rosie, Silver, and Willow. It had been a long, grueling night, but as she sat beside them, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They had faced the impossible and come through stronger than ever. Rosie had defied the odds, and in doing so, she had reminded Sarah of the boundless power of hope, love, and resilience. The days after the foaling were a blur of careful vigilance and cautious optimism. Sarah woke before the sun each morning, her first steps leading her to the barn where Rosie, Silver, and Willow rested. Every breath from the foals felt like a miracle, each tiny step a victory against the odds. Rosie, though visibly tired, stood proudly over her newborns, her maternal instincts a force of nature. Sarah often sat on the stool near their stall, her hands resting on the wooden rail as she watched the three of them. The barn, always a place of routine, now felt like a sanctuary where life had been renewed. John joined her more often now, his quiet presence a comfort as the two shared this unexpected chapter. "They're strong little ones," he said one morning, leaning against the stall door with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. His voice carried a hint of pride, though he tried to temper it with his usual practicality. That colt's got some fire in him already. Silver had begun testing his legs, his bold strides often leading him to nudge his sister playfully. Willow, in contrast, was delicate and observant, her movements cautious as though she was still unsure of the world around her. "They're perfect," Sarah said softly, her eyes fixed on Willow as the filly wobbled on spindly legs toward Rosie. "She's so small, but she's a fighter." John nodded, his gaze lingering on Sarah. "You were right to trust Rosie," he admitted after a long pause. "I wasn't sure we'd make it through this, but you never doubted her." Sarah turned to him, surprised by the rare vulnerability in his tone. "I couldn't," she said. "Rosie's always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I owed her that much." The ranch slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but life felt different now. News of Rosie's miraculous twin birth had spread quickly, first among the neighbors and then beyond the borders of their small town. Calls began to come in, reporters wanting to cover the story, families curious to see the foals, and equine enthusiasts marveling at the rarity of it all. At first, Sarah resisted the attention, wanting to keep the experience private. But John, ever the pragmatist, saw an opportunity. "This could be good for the ranch," he said one afternoon, as they stood by the paddock watching the foals. "A story like this doesn't come around often. People love a happy ending, and we could use the boost." Sarah hesitated, torn between her instinct to protect their quiet life and her understanding of the ranch's needs. "As long as it doesn't disrupt Rosie or the foals," she said finally, "their well-being comes first." When the first journalist arrived, Sarah was uneasy. The woman carried a camera and a notebook, her enthusiasm evident as she asked questions and snapped photos of Rosie standing tall, with Silver and Willow by her side. But to Sarah's relief, the article that followed was respectful and heartfelt, capturing not only the rarity of the twin birth, but also the bond between the Armstrong family and their animals. The story sparked more interest, and soon the ranch was hosting visitors. Families arrived with wide-eyed children eager to see the famous foals, their laughter echoing across the fields. Local businesses donated feed and supplies, grateful for the attention the story had brought to their community. The ranch, which had once felt burdened by the weight of uncertainty, now thrived under the light of renewed purpose. Sarah found herself at the center of it all, guiding tours and answering questions with a pride she hadn't expected. Silver quickly became a crowd favorite, his energetic nature endearing him to visitors, while Willow's quiet demeanor drew those with gentler spirits. Rosie, ever the patient matriarch, stood calmly amidst the attention, her serene presence a grounding force. Through it all, Sarah's bond with her father grew stronger. The shared experience of Rosie's pregnancy and the foal's birth had softened the distance between them, their conversations now filled with understanding rather than tension. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, John handed Sarah a worn envelope. "What's this?" she asked, turning it over in her hands. "Something I've been meaning to give you," John said. "It's the deed to the ranch. You've earned it." Sarah's breath caught as she opened the envelope and saw her name on the document. "Dad, John raised a hand to stop her. "I've been running this place my whole life, but it's time for me to step back. You've shown me that you're ready, Sarah. You've got the heart and the grit to keep this place alive. Rosie's not the only one who's proven herself." Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the envelope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," John said, his voice steady. The days turned into weeks, and the foals grew stronger with each passing day. Silver's curiosity often led him into mischief, and Sarah spent many mornings coaxing him back into the paddock after he'd wriggled through a gap in the fence. Willow, though more reserved, followed her brother's lead, her quiet determination evident in the way she tackled new challenges. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah stood in the paddock as the foals galloped through the golden grass, their coats shining in the early light. Rosie watched from a distance, her gaze calm and steady. Sarah walked over to the mare, resting a hand on her neck. "You've done more than anyone could have asked," she said softly. "Look at them. They're perfect because of you." Rosie nickered, her ears flicking towards Sarah as if in agreement. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah turned her gaze toward the horizon. The ranch stretched out before her, vibrant and full of life, a testament to resilience and hope. She felt a deep sense of peace settle over her, the kind that comes from knowing you've weathered the storm and emerged stronger. The foals bounded toward her, their energy infectious. Silver nudged her playfully, while Willow pressed her nose against her hand, seeking comfort. Sarah laughed, her heart full as she crouched to embrace them both. "You two are going to do great things," she said, her voice brimming with pride. Behind her, John leaned against the fence, a rare smile on his face as he watched his daughter with Rosie and the foals. The ranch, once burdened by uncertainty, now felt like a place of boundless possibility. As the day unfolded, Sarah stood in the paddock surrounded by the life she had fought so hard to protect. The journey had tested them all, but it had also brought them closer, revealing the strength they hadn't known they possessed. Rosie had carried more than just her foals. She had carried hope, love, and the unyielding spirit of the ranch itself. And as Sarah looked out over the fields, she knew their story was just beginning.